John S. Thompson, in his article on Lehi and Egypt in the book Glimpses of Lehi's Jerusalem, has described the evidence attests to a solidly established relationship between Egypt and Israel. Egyptian political and cultural influence in Israel surrounding the time of Lehi was at a peak. Egyptian language was being employed for record-keeping purposes, and the possibility of an Egyptian scribal tradition existing in the area of Jerusalem gives plausibility to the Book of Mormon's claim that Lehi and his posterity learned and used Egyptian for record-keeping purposes. The authenticity of the Book of Mormon continues to be sustained as the picture of Lehi's Jerusalem becomes clearer. I would like to share a very excellent idea by Matthew L. Bowen on the iron rod as the Word of God as Nephi's description of an Egyptian play on words and how the two interacting languages, Hebrew and Egyptian, in Lehi's day could have been used by Nephi. We now have even better literary evidence for the Book of Mormon traditions. An excellent little insight was given to us by Matthew L. Bowen called What Meaneth the Rod of Iron? This is on the Neil A. Maxwell Institute's website. He says, Latter-day Saint scholars Hugh Nibley and John Twetness have discussed at length how a staff or a rod and a sword can be commonly identified with the Word of God in the ancient Near East. The evidence they cite from the Bible, the earliest Hebrew commentators, modern biblical scholarship, and elsewhere affirms Nephi's unambiguous assertion that the Word of God is a rod. Now, further support for the antiquity of Nephi's imagery is detectable in his own comparison of the word to a rod, a comparison that may involve wordplay with the Egyptian hieroglyph itself for word and rod. Although we have the Book of Mormon text only in translation, and we don't know what the original wording of the text was, we can use our knowledge of the languages that the Nephite writers said they used, namely the Hebrew and Egyptian, and we can propose reasonable reconstructions. We note that the Egyptian word medu means not only a staff or a rod, but also to speak a word. The derived word medit or metit, probably pronounced mate in Lehi's day, was common in the Egyptian dialect of that time. It would have sounded very much like a common Hebrew word for rod or staff, which is mate. It's also very interesting that the Word of God, the expression medu neter, is a technical term. It's common in the Egyptian the dialect at that time, and it would have sounded like a term for divine revelation. Literally, the Word of God, or the divine decree. The phrase medu neter also denotes sacred writings themselves, what we would call the Scriptures, as well as the written characters or the script in which these sacred writings were written. Now let's consider Nephi's comparison of the word and the rod in the context of the Egyptian word medu. Nephi says, I beheld that the rod, the medu, the metit, the Hebrew word mate, that this rod of iron, which my father had seen, was the Word of God, which is the Egyptian medu. It's 1 Nephi 11:25. And they said unto me, this is his brothers asking Nephi the question, What meaneth the rod of iron which our father saw that led to the tree? And I said unto them that it was the Word of God. And whoso would hearken unto the Word of God, and would hold fast unto it, they would never perish. That's 1 Nephi 15:23-24. Now, an indication of Nephi's awareness of the play on words is his use of the expression to hold fast unto the Word of God. Since one can physically hold fast to a rod, but not to a word, Nephi's comparison of the rod of iron to the Word of God also makes very good sense in light of the other scriptural passages that employ the image of the iron rod. But Nephi's comparison here takes on even richer connotations when it's viewed as a play on multiple senses of the Egyptian word medu. Since Lehi's language consisted of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians, that's verse 2 in the first chapter of the Book of Mormon, we would reasonably expect that Lehi and his sons, Nephi in particular, were aware of and probably even used the common word medu or medet in at least some of those senses as the word. It seems unlikely that the word's phonetic similarity to Hebrew mate would have escaped their attention. On the contrary, it would plausibly explain Nephi's apparent substitution of word for the word rod in later remarks to his brothers in 1 Nephi 17:26 and verse 29. He says, "And ye know that by his word," the medu, the medet, "the waters of the Red Sea were divided. And yea, ye know that Moses by his word, according to the power of God which was in him, smote the rock, and there came forth water. But we know that Moses smote the rock with his staff, or his rod." Nephi calls it his word. It's a very interesting play on words. The imagery itself, along with its possible Egyptian language wordplay, further attests to the antiquity of the Book of Mormon. Certainly Joseph Smith in 1829 could not have known that medu meant both rod and word. However, Nephi, who lived 600 BC, likely had a good understanding of the nuances of these words, and he may have employed them as part of a powerful object lesson to his brothers. It's significant, in fact, that all of the medu-derived Egyptian words were originally written with the walking staff or the stick, according to Sir Alan Gardner. Thus, word, in its earliest Egyptian conception, was literally identified with a rod. And then the Hebrew mate is staff, rod, or shaft. It's derived from the triliteral root nth, which as a verb means to stretch out, to spread out, extend, incline, or bend. Thus I suspect that Lehi's first mention of the rod of iron might well constitute a polypopton, words derived from the same root and used in the same sentence on nth. Here's what Lehi says, "And I beheld a rod, a mate, of iron, and it extended along the bank of the river, and led to the tree by which I stood." That's 1 Nephi 8:19. An Egyptian transliteration of the Hebrew mate, which is rod, and the Egyptian medu metet, the rod or word, would have been graphically similar or even identical if written in demotic characters in the Egyptian language. So that is a nifty little literary evidence based upon the archaeological discoveries that we now understand the history of Judah, 600 BC, to have been intimately entwined with the culture of the ancient Egyptians, as well as the politics. This is what Lehi and Jeremiah were railing against. As a world military power, Egypt had declined. As a cultural, influential arena, Egypt was still the powerhouse. This was the Saitic dynasty, the 26th dynasty. Egypt's last hurrah as far as culturally influential throughout the entire area. The Book of Mormon properly reflects this Sitz im Leben.